In the murky corners of Cold War history, beneath layers of radio static, the chilling tale of the Judica-Cordiglia brothers emerges. Armed with makeshift radio equipment and relentless curiosity, they claim to capture ghostly transmissions from doomed Soviet cosmonauts, voices never acknowledged by any official records. Were these lost transmissions evidence of a buried truth, or the echoes of a grand conspiracy? This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 10. I'm your host Ben, as always, and it's good to be back on the mic. This week, I thought we'd do a bit of a different episode. I say different, it's not really that different. I've done episodes like this before. I think the one it mostly reminds me of is the Numbers Station episode, but I feel like I haven't done like a good fun conspiracy episode for a long time, like a good sort of Cold War conspiracy. So I thought, we'd sort of jump into this episode, partly because it's a good fun Cold War conspiracy, and partly because it's absolutely terrifying. But anyway, I shall leave you to decide that. With that said, nothing else to say this week, so let's move straight into it. This is the Judica-Cordiglia brothers and the lost cosmonauts of the Cold War. July 20th, 1969 saw Neil Armstrong descend the ladder of the lunar lander and walk on the surface of the moon. In his speech, he infamously told the world watching in that it was one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. It was also one big win for America in the race for the moon, a fierce and incredibly demanding and expensive competition that had been raging for more than a decade. Following the defeat of Germany at the end of the Second World War in Europe, both the Soviets and the Americans worked to recruit and relocate scientists, engineers and technicians from the German rocket programs that had had such success during the war. On the American side, Wernher von Braun, a member of the SS and architect of the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, was a key member of the US Army's rocket development project throughout the 1950s and 60s. This scramble for German science was not a frivolous task. Throughout the warring years, the United States and the Soviets had been uneasy allies, with deep suspicions on both sides, and following the war, with the power vacuum left from a war-torn Europe, both parties saw themselves as the new ruling superpower, and as the testing of nuclear force grew ever larger, so too did the ideological divide. It was here that the German rocket scientists would prove their worth to their new masters, helping both powers to create rockets with which to mount their nuclear warheads. As the race for nuclear dominance took off, so too did the race for space, with both milestones utilising similar technologies. The Germans had in fact already sent a V-2 rocket to space way back in 1944, when they shot the test rocket MW-1814 straight up 109 miles into the air, breaking the Earth's atmosphere before it came crashing back down to the ground. At the time, the test had not been considered especially significant. But now, in the new post-war world, with two competing superpowers looking to showcase their cultural influence, military prowess and national prestige to the world, the ability to fire a rocket into space became paramount in order to win the symbolic and very meaningful victory of space supremacy. Rockets were developed, and then, in the mid-1950s, both sides publicly outed their plans to send a satellite into space, though the Americans were a little more open about their Explorer program than the Soviets, who worked hard to keep their Sputnik program tightly under wraps. In 1957, the space race began in earnest, when on October the 4th, the Soviets introduced the world to Sputnik 1, a beeping metal sphere that circled the Earth after being shot into low Earth orbit via one of the world's most powerful rockets. Just days later, the Soviets tested their largest ever hydrogen bomb, the optics of which were very much intentional. For 3 weeks, Sputnik cruised around the Earth before the batteries depleted, ending its radio bleeps. The Soviet accomplishment of sending a satellite into space came as a shock to much of the world. With so much propaganda coming from both sides, the public were far from informed on either side's true capabilities. And then, less than a month later, the Soviets repeated their first mission sending Sputnik 2 into space, this time carrying the now infamous dog, Laika. Laika did not survive much past 5 hours in space, but the launch cemented the Soviets as the leaders in the race. Unenthused by their falling behind, the Americans doubled down on their efforts, and finally they launched their own satellite, Explorer 1, into low Earth orbit in February of 1958. In July of the same year, NASA was established, absorbing and continuing America's earlier programs for manned spaceflight. It was 3 more years before their fruits would be revealed to the world, however, and once again, the Americans were pipped at the post when Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, travelling aboard the Soviet Vostok 1 rocket. Gagarin circled the Earth for 108 minutes before re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Yuri Gagarin became an overnight hero and the Soviet space program a triumph. The Americans were not too far behind, sending their own man, Alan Shepard, into suborbital flight less than a month later, and then John Glenn became the first American astronaut to complete an orbital spaceflight a year later. Still, the Soviet Union had won the battle, but the war had many years left to run, and the American space program would prove victorious with their Apollo missions that left an unprecedented legacy. But what if this history was not entirely true? The end of the space race may well be truly written in stone, but what of the beginning? What if Yuri Gagarin was not simply the first Soviet cosmonaut in space, but rather the first cosmonaut to successfully return to Earth? Perhaps the early Soviet missions had not all been the instant successes they seemed. There were 2 Italian brothers who believed just that, and better yet, they believed that they had the evidence to prove it. But in a world of propaganda, where the lines between fact and fiction become ever more blurred, just how convincing was their story? And would anyone believe them anyway? In all the excitement of the early space race, the public were often the least well informed on the truth of what was happening in the space programs, as the Americans and the Soviets squared up to battle for supremacy. Stories of both countries' satellites were filtered through government press releases and local media, so that by the time most read news about Sputnik or Explorer, neither were especially close to the reality. For the average Joe, the closest one could come to the space stations was through the use of amateur ham radio. And though anyone with the equipment capable to listen in on the satellites were a rarity at the time, a handful of amateur operators around the world managed to do exactly that. Shortly after the news of the first Sputnik satellite made it to the pages of the American newspapers, radio operators were dialing in on its 20 megahertz bands, hoping to catch a faint bleep as the metal sphere sped overhead. At the same time, members of Columbia University's amateur radio club actually managed to tape and rebroadcast the satellite's transmission, much to the aggravation of the FBI, who visited Thomas Hamilton, one of the club's members, the next day in order to confiscate the recording. These early forays into directly listening in on space missions created a rich relationship between radio hams and space that continues right up till today, with hams communicating directly with astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Back in 1957, 24-year-old Achille and 18-year-old Giovanni Battista Judica-Cordiglia were 2 Italian brothers with such an interest in radio. Both the young men had fostered their interest for radio 6 years earlier, before anyone had even heard of anything called Sputnik. For them, the thrill was less about hearing the beeps and boops of metal objects in space. It was about hearing the many different languages of people from distant countries. It's very exciting, they said, to listen to other people's voices. As teenagers, the 2 brothers were the very best of friends. They did everything together and had fallen into radio in the same way by sharing a mutual love for tinkering and experimentation. In the attic of their home in Erba, in northern Italy, they built a makeshift radio setup with the help of an electrician friend, using surplus military equipment that had been cast off at 5 cents per pound following the Second World War. Pulling apart bits of old machines and reassembling them into new, Frankenstein-like metal boxes, they managed to piece together a radio transmitter and began to transmit themselves over the airways, quite unaware that such things needed special licenses. Naturally, they discovered as much when the police showed up at their door a few days later. Much of these early experiments were filmed by the boys with a handheld camera, which they later edited into quirky little films, all of which played into what they called their love for mischief. As the years ticked by, the brothers' passion for radio continued to grow, as did their setup. By now, the family had moved to Turin, in northern Italy, just south of the Swiss Alps, where the boys added to their recycled station by purchasing old radio receivers from American warplanes, which they then repaired themselves. By now, it was October of 1957, and the news of the Soviet satellite Sputnik was beginning to filter out to the world. Unsurprisingly, Achille and Giovanni heard the news on their radio, of all places, as they sat and ate their dinner, and as soon as they were finished, they raced to their makeshift laboratory to see if they could capture the transmission. Turning the dials, they listened intently until the sounds of the metronomic beeps emerged from the white noise. Urged to capture the signal, they hit a button on a reel-to-reel tape machine sitting on the same counter as the radio and recorded the signal. The two young brothers, quite unknowingly, were within the first group of people outside of the Soviet space program itself to listen in on the mysterious satellite that, to everyone else, was little more than an abstract concept. Both the boys, however, were a little sceptical of what they'd been hearing. No one in Europe or America, after all, had really been expecting the Soviets to have been capable of launching a satellite. And so, not wanting to take the sound as direct evidence in itself, the two boys measured the frequency of the transmission and verified via the Doppler effect that it was a genuine transmission from Sputnik. In their small makeshift radio lab, they had forged a direct link to outer space, and the whole thing had been absolutely thrilling. Far beyond the human voices that they'd grown more accustomed to listening in on, and which until now had been quite enjoyable enough, the satellite had given them a whole new plane to listen on. And so the boys spent the next few weeks listening in to white noise, trying to pull signal from sound, hoping to catch whatever they could. Their enthusiasm paid off, and less than a month later, they caught a new signal, this time seemingly more erratic than the unerrable bloops and bleeps of Sputnik. Listening to the sound, Giovanni, a medical student at the time, suggested it might be that of a heartbeat. And so, after waking their father and having him listen to the signal too, they took their own dog, a small poodle, and listened to its heartbeat via a stethoscope in order to compare the sounds to those that they had heard on the radio. Still not completely sure, they played the recording to a local vet, who also agreed that the bleeps did seem to sound like a dog's heartbeat. It was only later, much to their excitement, that they heard of Sputnik 2 and its canine passenger, Laika. With another successful, verified recording under their belt, the brothers set about designing and building more, bigger and better antennas mounted on the terrace of their apartment roof, with which they could use to intercept more signals. They finished just in time to capture the launch of the Explorer 1, which would be America's first satellite into space, trading just behind the Soviets. The continuous signal of the American satellite was different to the beeps of Sputnik, but it was just as exciting for the brothers. This recording of the Explorer satellite saw the brothers launched into the media, where they were mentioned on Italian radio during a rebroadcast of their tape. As the months passed, they continued to enjoy their recordings, listening in on the space race that was growing in intensity and stature with every new news story as the Cold War began to heat up. By the time 1960 had rolled around, the radio intercepts the boys were carrying out were growing in importance, a fact that the boys themselves seemed to be fairly innocent to. They just wanted to continue their hobby, eavesdropping for fun. And then, on November 28th, 1960, they picked up a recording that seemed to take on a darker tone. Listening in through the static, the brothers thought they were picking up what sounded like a Morse signal of 3 short dots, followed by 3 longer dashes, and then 3 more short dots. Fairly convinced that this was an SOS call, they listened in more carefully, finding that not only was it getting softer, it appeared to be travelling away from the Earth, much faster than the orbiting speed of the satellites that they had captured before. This transmission posed a host of difficult questions. First and foremost, why would an unmanned craft transmit an SOS signal? If the craft then was manned, it must have meant that the Soviets were now sending people into space. It followed then that whatever the mission was supposed to be, it had clearly failed. Otherwise, again, why would it be transmitting a distress signal? This, the two brothers theorized, was the sound of a mission going catastrophically wrong. The Soviets, they believed, had secretly launched a cosmonaut into space, but failed to bring him back to Earth. The reason the SOS was getting fainter and fainter was that the craft, or whatever it was travelling at high speeds away from the Earth, casting out to space with seemingly no hope of return. This recording once again gained the brothers a little more fame, at least locally, when the same Swiss-Italian radio station that they had sent their original recordings of the Explorer to before had them on as experts on the Soviet signals, working to fill a void that any lack of official press had formed. It was the start of a media career that would see the two young men radio in from their home to give the latest news on their discoveries. As for the mystery SOS signal, there was never any official news anywhere about a failed cosmonaut mission, and certainly not anything from the Soviets themselves. So for an agonizing 4 months, the brothers scanned the airwaves, hoping to find their next clue. Anything that could give them more information on what they had heard, or maybe even a new story to tell. Then, finally, on February the 2nd, 1961, they picked up something different once again from the crackle of the radio. It was about 5 p.m. in Italy when the mysterious sounds came through the airwaves into the brothers' little radio lab. Confused at first by what they were hearing, Achille confided in his medical professor at university, who agreed to listen to the tapes, immediately verifying that the breathing sounds were almost certainly a human breathing under heavy labour. He also verified the second recording as a human heartbeat. Just like the previous recording, this signal grew fainter with time and seemed to be moving away from the Earth at a rapid speed. Once again, the brothers thought they had recorded the sound of a cosmonaut being ejected from Earth, lost into space. Just like before, their theories were of course impossible to verify, though when a few days later the Soviets admitted to having one of their satellites disintegrate on launch, the brothers felt they had perhaps heard something of the real story. By now, the brothers' recordings had been making splashes growing ever wider thanks to their newfound radio fame, and the two had gained enough notoriety to have been contacted by an editor for the Italian National Press Agents, Ugo Saratorio, who, after listening to Soviet radio broadcasts, had a hunch that something big was on the horizon. Not known to Ugo yet was that the upcoming mission was for Vostok 1, within which the Soviets planned to send Yuri Gagarin into space. Publicly, this would be the first ever human in space, so naturally it would be huge news, both for the Italian press and for the brothers, who immediately started listening in and learnt of the truth of the mission. Right on cue, they heard the familiar sounds of the Soviet machines, this time accompanied by a voice of a man as he hurtled above the Earth, capturing several minutes of audio before the capsule re-entered into the Earth's atmosphere, heating up to such a degree that its radio transmissions were cut out. It was an incredible moment to have witnessed firsthand, and the boys were ecstatic with their recording of what would soon become a huge milestone in the history of space exploration. Following the recording, the boys immediately contacted Hugo, the editor, who sent a journalist out straight away to listen to the recording for himself. Within hours, the boys' own recordings, captured from a small homemade radio lab from disused military components, were being broadcast on radio across the world. The boys had a big problem though. Until now, they'd been recording beeps and boops from satellites, not the voices of Russian cosmonauts. If the Soviets were planning on sending more men into space, then the boys wanted to hear them, and more, they wanted to understand them. To this end, they pushed their younger sister, Tessa, to study Russian so that she could help them translate these mysterious messages. They also contacted a former East German defector who had fled to Italy, named Rosemary Groling, who agreed to help them make more precise translations of the complete recordings. At the same time, they also knew they had to get more serious about their equipment if they were to progress as the Swiss-Italian radio's experts. Casting their net for a new location, for a much larger operation, they came across a disused German World War II bunker named Torrebert in a small village 12 miles from their home in Turin. Here, they founded their independent space listening station, complete with wall charts, monitors, 5-foot-tall banks of radio equipment, and a large movable antenna built from scrap metal and old truck parts. It didn't take long for these moves to pay off, as in May of 1961, the brothers picked up a new recording, and this time the voice sounded far and away from the controlled tones of Yuri Gagarin. And what's more, it sounded like the voice of a woman. As they made their recording, the two brothers asked their sister to translate the strained cries. Whoever it was seemed to be trying to contact some sort of command centre, telling them that she was overheating and having difficulty breathing. As things grew more desperate, the voice talked about seeing flames as they re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and then silence. It was a terrifying transmission to have listened to on its own, but with the help of their sister, who was able to give them small snippets of information on what was being said, the whole thing seemed disturbing beyond what they had experienced until now. Whatever they had heard, the brothers were convinced that they had made a recording of the first woman in space. Lack of any news from the Soviets, however, seemed to confirm their worst theories, that, whoever she had not returned to Earth alive. For the brothers, their listening in on the Soviet space program seemed to take on a new meaning. No longer were they simply eavesdropping on covert transmissions, they were documenting the fate of the lost cosmonauts who never made the news, nor gained the recognition that they felt they deserved, like Gagarin had done just months earlier. The brothers were also gearing up for another big news story. The Americans, they knew, were planning to send a man into orbit, the second official human ever to make the trip, and they were adamant on listening to it. The problem they had, however, was the lack of cooperation from the American side, who were refusing to publish the radio band the mission would be broadcast upon. Not content with giving up, the two brothers obtained a photo of a Mercury capsule being retrieved from the ocean, similar to the capsule that John Glenn, the astronaut chosen to pilot the mission, would be using on his orbital trip. Using measurements taken from the faces of the men in the photograph that were circling the capsule at sea, they calculated the length of the antenna and thus correlated the radio band that the mission would likely use. It was a clever bit of deduction, and it worked for the brothers magically, who were able to tune in to record the mission as the Americans sent their first man into orbit. By now, it wasn't only the Italian press and radio who were taking notice of the boys eavesdropping. During John Glenn's mission, the American consul in Turin had showed up to Torre Bert in order to listen in as they essentially hacked into the American radio frequency. He even offered to translate the signal for them in real time. This was all very serious stuff. Not that the brothers really noticed. To them, it was still all just fun and games, and they treated the signal interceptions as nothing more than a hobby, completely failing to realise that what they were essentially doing was acting a lot like spies. They woke up to this in a very real way when a Soviet KGB agent posing as a journalist turned up at their front door, demanding to see the boys' radio equipment. They turned the man away and no harm was done, but it was something of an eye-opener for just how serious the Cold War had become for the two brothers. From that recording on, the Italian Secret Service also became increasingly interested in their recordings, and they sent men round to listen in whilst they made them, having Tessa translate as the interceptions were made. Once again, the antennas were increased, doubling in size to 15 metres across, and new equipment was constantly brought in, all in an effort to track the race to the moon. By the mid-1960s, the brothers had grown a long way from their little hobby, assembling makeshift radio receivers in the attic of their Turin family apartment. Each time recordings were made, the rooms were filled with journalists, officials, friends and family, as well as the 15 members that the brothers had recruited to run the station, and each new transmission was met with media and government attention. They'd even managed to make their way to TV, having been guests on an Italian game show that introduced them as the famous Judica-Cordiglia brothers. The questions in the show were based, of course, on space, and their prize for acing that subject was a trip to the NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., in the United States of America. Whilst there, they played the officials the recording that they had made of John Glenn aboard the Mercury capsule, carrying out his mission as the first American to orbit the Earth, much to the shock of the NASA bigwigs. The brothers capitalised on this shock of the officials by striking a deal to trade information, leading to them obtaining new frequencies with which they could track future NASA broadcasts. Naturally, the Soviets didn't take too kindly to this new relationship, and they set about discrediting the brothers with the Red Star, a state-owned Soviet newspaper, writing an article about them, calling them space gangsters. When the boys found out, they thought this was incredibly amusing, that their penchant for making mischief was taking off on an international scale. Moscow radio also ran a story discrediting the brothers' claims that Soviet cosmonauts had perished in space. For the brothers, this denial was seen as little more than a confession. As the decade continued on and the space race neared its grand finale, the brothers played their small role in broadcasting the American moon landing live on Swiss-Italian radio. It was the end of the space race, but also the end of much of the public interest in space exploration. As the years ticked by, the interest in the brothers' radio interceptions slowly began to phase out, especially once the Soviets backed down. The Judica-Cordiglia brothers had followed along, covertly tapping into and recording much of the action directly, and even uncovering some truly dark and horrifying stories that had seemingly been brushed under the carpet. But was any of it really true at all? Or were the brothers just carrying on the mischief that they had publicly admitted to have enjoyed much earlier? The story of the Judica-Cordiglia brothers is one of great intrigue, but it has never been free from controversy and criticism, even during the time the recordings were made, and the scepticism has only grown since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. For starters, one of the major criticisms centered around the recordings was the lack of any known Soviet protocol used by the supposed cosmonauts. None of the recordings show any usage of call signs, and no use of any official language that was known to have been used throughout the space program. Furthermore, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so much secret information has been uncovered and shared, including many more embarrassing and troubling things than a few lost cosmonauts. But nothing has ever been brought to light concerning any space flights that matched the brothers' mysterious archived tapes. Concerning the recording of the alleged female cosmonaut specifically, allegations have been made concerning the use of a very strange form of Russian grammar in her speech, likening it to someone learning the language or speaking Russian as a second language, and not anything like an educated Soviet cosmonaut. Someone, it is clearly suggested, much like their sister Tessa. Had they perhaps enlisted her to act out a scenario in her broken Russian, which they then recorded and passed off as a genuine transmission? Furthermore, some of the brothers' timelines don't always seem to add up to known Soviet launches. In early 1961, for example, when the brothers said they'd recorded the sounds of breathing and a supposed heartbeat, the Soviets were making unmanned launches of vehicles designed to fly past Venus. These would almost certainly not have had anyone on board, however, as the missions were never meant to return to Earth in the first place. Were these the confusions of age and the distortions of time having an effect on memory, or were they evidence that all of it was perhaps not quite as it seemed in the brothers' recorded archive? On the flip side, everyone knew that the Soviet space program was surrounded by secrecy. Whereas the Americans made much of their space program in the global press, the Soviets continuously sought to cover up, obfuscate and distort the truth in an ongoing effort to maintain control over the narrative that they wanted to present to the world, precisely when they wanted it presented. In such an atmosphere, it seems easy to believe that the official truth coming from the Soviet press was almost certainly not to be trusted. By now, the brothers' story had aged, and their fame, short-lived and niche as it was, had faded to some degree. But the brothers stand by their story. Achille sadly passed away a few years ago, but in a recent interview with Vice, Giovanni has denied any possibility that the recordings were faked categorically. His sister, he said, had not learnt Russian well enough to speak it by the earliest recordings, and as for the protocol, his defence is that he believes that in the types of moments that they captured, the use of such protocol would just simply have been tossed out the window in the panic of the whole situation. From a technical perspective, Giovanni insisted that the evidence of the Doppler effect in the recordings rules out any idea of a hoax without question. His overwhelming feeling of the whole affair is of the desire to bring to light the names and lives of the cosmonauts he believes he recorded alongside his brother, hearing their last words as they were flung hopelessly out into space, never to be seen or heard from again. Conspiracies about Soviet space disasters have run rife since the very early 1960s. as American propagandists sought to taint the Soviet space program at home, and thanks to the impenetrable shroud of secrecy that surrounded the Soviet Union for many of its experiments in science, the conspiracy has persisted and endured right up until today, where distrust of Cold War-era establishments on all sides has only ever grown. Whether or not the truth of the Judica-Cordiglia archive will ever be discovered, the legacy of the two young men, driven by curiosity and passion to play their own small role in the space race, will long live on in the immense archive that remains stashed away in an old basement in Turin that followed along step by step with one of the greatest displays of technological advancement the world has ever seen. If the lost cosmonauts are ever uncovered, then the brothers' recordings will have played a very important role in this discovery. On the other hand, if the truth always remains a mystery, then the brothers will certainly have achieved their secondary role as two young men who very much enjoyed making mischief. So that was the story of the Judica-Cordiglia brothers and their lost cosmonaut theories. And we'll talk a little bit about that because I suppose there is a bit to talk about after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yeah, it's a short episode, but I really thought it was one that was worth doing because not least, the recordings are absolutely terrifying, but also because, this story is often told quite poorly on like YouTube and things like that, where people just want to rush out a sort of 5-minute episode that just has a bunch of the recordings and really nothing about the brothers' lives and their operation, because the operation itself was incredible. Like they made a movable antenna, and they used like the steering wheel from an old truck and like ball bearings from truck wheels and things like that to make this thing work, because basically this sort of antenna that they were building was just simply unfeasible for really any private citizen, unless you were a multi-millionaire at that point, even a billionaire really back then. Like it was the sort of thing that governments made, not sort of private citizens. And so their only option was to build it themselves, and they did, out of scrap, and it was incredible. And just all this kind of small ingenuity and stuff, their story was really, really incredible. They're two brothers who I think you can just wait. I've seen a few interviews with both of the men, and just their enthusiasm and their passion just really shines through, and it's a really good story to tell. So yeah, that was kind of one of the other reasons that I wanted to sort of write a better story about it, one that more focused on the men and their entire kind of arc, like the projection of the studio that they set up, and of course there's much more to it than what I've included in this episode. There's a really good documentary from like 2007 that is available on YouTube that you can dig up, called Space Hackers. It's worth a watch if you fancy it. But yeah, as to whether or not what they recorded was true or not, that's a different story. I've got absolutely no doubt that they were listening in on satellites. I've got absolutely no doubt as to their abilities with radio. I'm quite sure that they were intelligent enough and that they've got the recordings to back it up. They were definitely listening in on satellites and all sorts of stuff. What I'm less convinced about is whether or not it's true. I also don't have any doubt really that they were capable of a hoax. Firstly, that they seem to be two. And this isn't really the right thing, but they were two very fun-loving brothers, right? When you see their operation, they filmed almost all of it, and they made all these quirky little videos, and you can see the whole time they're very. I don't want to say they didn't take anything seriously, because clearly they did, because they built an entire radio station. You have to take things seriously to achieve those sorts of things, right? But they did everything with I guess, a love for life, you can say, and everything was a bit of fun to them. And so from that aspect alone, I think they could very much have decided to make a hoax. We can be a little bit more cynical, I think, than that, and push it a little bit further as well, and say that perhaps once they'd tasted a little bit of kind of fame and excitement and buzz around their project, they decided to maybe egg it a little bit. One sort of, I think, good piece of evidence for this is the fact that a lot of the kind of more mysterious recordings finish around about 1962, 1963, just as they were getting quite serious and they started getting a lot more press attention and started getting a lot more people come to basically visit them whilst they made their recordings. And all of a sudden their recordings are much more down to earth, which makes me wonder if a lot of these recordings they made were just at home and they were sort of egging it on to sort of give a little bit of excitement and sass to their story. After all, it worked, right? They got put on the radio as experts. They talked about these recordings, and really they were only feeding into what was already out there. You know, there was already so much propaganda about the Soviet space program and how, you know, that they were having all these accidents and such things. That, you know, this conspiracy about lost cosmonauts, it's not created by them. You know, it goes back a long way. And so I wonder if they were just feeding off of that and decided to make these things, you know, that they were recording satellites and they just thought, why not just sort of make up some extra spice? A less cynical sort of outlook on it would be that perhaps what they were recording were recordings. You know, so perhaps the Soviets put little recordings into their satellites or, you know, vehicles so that they could track them. You know, they did, you know, this was the reason Sputnik beeped, right? So they could track it. So perhaps they just did that. With the Morse one might be a good example, you know, because it's a continuous sort of like clicking sound or tapping sound. So, you know, perhaps that was just there for tracking. I can easily believe that this is something that might be the case. And so in this sense, you know, the two brothers, rather than sort of intentionally misleading anyone, they were sort of recording things and miscategorizing it or misunderstanding them. I wonder if it's just a bit of both. You know, I wonder if they did sort of, especially the one with the woman that was potentially their sister. I think that's maybe true. And you know, I think others were maybe just Soviet tapes on unmanned vehicles. Who knows? What I don't think is this lost cosmonaut thing is that true. But here's why, you know, a good conspiracy works, because on paper, it does seem feasible. You know, the Soviets did obfuscate everything. And so, you know, you do end up just having that seed of doubt in your mind. Like, yeah, okay, I say all this stuff, but, you know, does anyone trust anything from, not necessarily just the Soviets, everyone in that deep Cold War were making stuff up, right? And it was hard to trust anyone, really. But the Soviets were, you know, clearly good at it. And I say that's what makes a good conspiracy, you know, a good, fun conspiracy that we can kind of talk about and wonder about for years to come. Is it just plants that little seed of doubt and it makes you think, yeah, but maybe. You know, it's the same sort of thing with like Bigfoot and aliens and things like that, right? On paper, it doesn't make sense, but maybe, you know, just maybe it's there and it makes you think. Anyway, that's why I think this is an enjoyable little conspiracy. I used to love conspiracies when I was younger. I feel like these days conspiracies have been tainted by a different sort of people these days, and it's all very, I don't know, angry. Whereas it used to be a bit more fun, and these conspiracies like this, I feel like they're a bit more fun. So I hope you enjoyed it. Anyway, yeah, that's enough of that episode, I think. If you'd like to contact me, if you've got any thoughts on it, please do so. My email is contact@darkhistories.com. There's also all the social media. I'm Dark Histories on there. You can find all links to that in the show notes and on the website, which is darkhistories.com. On the website, you'll also find all different ways that you can support if you would like to do so. It doesn't always have to be financial, you know, just sort of giving reviews, things like that, you know, sharing the podcast with friends, family, or online. Massive help for me. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, as always. It's been a real pleasure. Until next week, I'll be back with another Yesterday Today episode, and then in 2 weeks with another full Dark Histories episode. So until then, take care and sleep tight.